Recording in progress.
Our first reading may sound like the Gettysburg Address, but it is actually written by Unitarian minister Theodore Parker, and it was written over a decade before it appears in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. You will certainly recognize the words. A democracy that is a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. Of course, a government of the principles of external justice, the unchanging law of God. For a lesser's sake, I shall call the ideal freedom. Also from the Reverend Theodore Parker is our second reading. And although you may associate this with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it was actually written over a century before, again by Theodore Parker. I do not pretend to understand the universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure of experience by only my sight, but I can divine it by my conscience. And from what I see, it bends toward justice. Before I jump in here, first of all, I just want to congratulate you all for making it here this morning, between the changing from Zoom and to back to being in person. And then we changed the time from 10:30 to 10. And then on top of it all, the daylight changing as we fell back last night with our clocks. So first of all, congratulations for just getting here this morning. That is a great thing. And it's so good to see all your faces. As you know, our theme this month is holding history. And that might mean your personal history. It might mean your family's history. It also might mean our history here at the Unitarian Fellowship of McMinnville. But it also means our Unitarian Universalist history. And I want to talk with you today about three different Unitarians because our faith tradition is so amazing in its past and it continues to be. I want to say that in 2018 at our General Assembly, which was held in Kansas City, and General Assembly is when people come from congregations, lay leaders come, ministers come, thousands of us join together at this central location. And that year, we were being picketed by the Hillsboro Baptist Church. And for any of you who don't know who the Hillsboro Baptist Church is, they take an incredibly conservative stance on any LGBTQ, believing that it is an abomination to be involved in any of that belief or practice. And they do so in such a hateful manner. They come and picket the funerals, the memorial services of people who died in hate crimes, like Matthew Shepard, who was beaten to death because he was gay. And so the Hillsboro Baptists, it is not just how they think about things, it is how they act out their protest. And there they were, picketing us at General Assembly. And let me tell you, you know your faith is on the right side of the issues when you are being picketed by the Hillsboro Baptist Church. And our young people flooded out to the street and they sang songs of love, and they would not engage in that same kind of hateful dialogue. This is our amazing faith tradition. So I am going to talk about three Unitarian Universalists. They happen to all be in that early to mid 1800 time. One of whom I've taken the subtitle of this sermon from. It's Horace Mann, who, after hearing Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, experienced what he called a spiritual resurrection of purpose. Why social justice work was always important to man, it was after hearing a Unitarian minister that he experienced this resurrection of spiritual purpose. I'm also going to talk about Dorothea Dix, who brought about reforms for the mentally ill and for prisons. And Theodore Parker, who you've already heard his words, he was a fiery abolitionist. He also supported women's suffrage. He was involved in education for poor people and immigrants. And I want you, as I go through these stories, to listen for 4 things. And I know you're not going to remember 4 things. Maybe just remember 1. How each of these people became proximate to the issue, proximate to the suffering. How they changed the narrative of the poor, the mentally ill, the enslaved. And third, they fought against hopelessness. When it became hard during their cause, they persevered. They knew something was better. And fourth, they all took paths that were not comfortable or convenient, and they experienced ridicule because of their beliefs. I'm going to start with Dorothea Dix, who lived from 1802 to 1887. Her first profession was that of a teacher, but she went on to lead a national crusade for the decent treatment of the mentally ill. Dix probably developed this interest because she came from a very difficult childhood. She was brilliant. She ran away from home at the age of 12 because of the difficulties in her home, her alcoholic father, and her mother, who it sounds as though in present-day language suffered from mental illness. So she ran away to an aunt's home in Massachusetts. And by the age of 14, she was running her own school. People paid to send their kids, the students, to her school. Dix describes feeling the most spiritually alive, this spiritual resurrection of purpose, when she was dealing with the direct day-to-day needs of the people. She didn't see intellectualizing as something she was interested in, the intellectualization of the problem and the debate. Rather, it was being there with people doing the work. When her grandmother died, her grandmother left her a reasonable sum of money, so she was really able to focus even more. So she started having classes for families who could not afford to pay to send their kids to school. She started having classes for them at night. And she started teaching a Sunday school class in the East Cambridge jail. And when she went there to teach, she found the conditions so disturbing. The mentally ill were housed with prisoners, and those who were convicted were housed with those still awaiting trial. She went on to investigate the conditions of of people who were called the boarded out, who were mentally ill, and they served as free labor on farms. She found them living in terrible conditions, malnourished and cold. She took all of this, being proximate with the people and seeing the suffering and holding out hope, and she rewrote their narrative. She wrote it in a report to the Massachusetts legislature. However, because women could not give testimony during that time, she had to have a fellow reformer, Samuel Gridley Howe, speak her words. And Howe, also a Unitarian, was not taking credit for her work, was not pretending that he had done the pieces that she had done. Rather, he amplified her voice and tried to give even more legitimacy and support to her cause. But he held her at the forefront, her heart, her work. So Gridley gave the presentation, and Dorothea Dix was there sitting beside him. And as too often happens, her report was met with denial, this isn't really happening, or anger at her reporting it. But her perseverance and her rewriting that narrative of what is possible finally allowed to the first state hospital for the mentally ill to be founded, and she went on to reform the condition of many jails and institutions. And it also led her to a lifelong friendship with someone serving in the Massachusetts legislature at that time, and that was Horace Mann, who I'm going to talk about next. Horace Mann was also not born a Unitarian, but after hearing Channing preach, the same Channing that Dix heard, and it became a catalyst for her work, he left his career as a promising politician to work to implement a Massachusetts statewide system of free public schools. He was raised in poverty in Franklin, Massachusetts. His family was so impoverished that he could not attend school regularly. And a turning point for Mann in his development was when, on a Sunday, his older brother had been skating on a pond. He broke through the ice and was drowned. A Calvinist minister came and did the memorial service. And the Calvinists believe you were either predestined to hell or predestined to heaven. And there was a lot of fire and brimstone, a lot of punishment. So this Calvinist minister said it was really Stephen's own fault, the older brother, because he was out skating on the Sabbath. It was his fault. He was dead. And Horace Mann talks about that not only was the death of his brother so tragic and such an emotional impact on him, but that this memorial service was absolutely traumatic. Mann began searching for a different vision of God, of spirituality, and of meaning. See, there he is. He's rewriting a narrative. God is a God of love. I need to believe in a God who cares. I need to believe in a God who would not take a life from a teenager for skating on the Sabbath. Mann was brilliant, and even though he was poor, he was eventually awarded a scholarship to Brown University in Rhode Island. After that, he studied law and set up a practice and began serving in the Massachusetts legislature. And while living in a boarding home, he began to know two Unitarian women. They were also transcendentalists. And for any of you who know who the Peabody sisters were, it was two of the Peabody sisters. They were hugely involved in society at that time. So they took him to see William Ellery Channing. And at that time is when he said, I have the spiritual resurrection of purpose. Horace Mann was a very successful senator, and he was groomed for governor. He was also groomed to go on to the U.S. Senate. But he left it all because he went to pursue having the state provide free public education for all children. And he succeeded. My third Unitarian, Theodore Parker, was also contemporary of Mann and Dix. And while a fierce abolitionist, he actually died before the Emancipation Proclamation. There were many Unitarian and Universalist abolitionists. Many worked only at educational or legislative efforts, which should not be disparaged in any way. But Parker was involved in the really nitty-gritty, in there with the people. Parker was a Unitarian minister in the 1800s and a fierce abolitionist, a strong advocate for the poor and the immigrant poor, and he supported women's suffrage. He was also extremely outspoken that Christianity appeared to be a religion about Jesus, created by man, than the actual religious practices of Jesus. So he wanted to go back to that theological core of what Jesus actually preached and how he actually acted out his faith beliefs in real life. So while he believed Jesus was inspired by God and living a very holy life, he was not God. He was not the God-human hybrid in one for Parker. And this view made him extremely unpopular with clergy of the time, as you can imagine. The other thing that made Theodore Parker unpopular with even Unitarian ministers is he was deeply entangled in the debate over obeying the fugitive slave law. In 1850, the fugitive slave law was passed, and all states, even free states, were ordered to turn in escaped formerly enslaved blacks. And for any of you who have already encountered Parker's name, the story that is so often told about him is he is writing sermons on Saturday night with a pistol on his desk and a sword near his right hand. Now, I can assure you, I have never felt the need to do either of those things during sermon writing. So Parker was living in a dangerous time, doing things at risk to his physical self. Because what he was doing is he had escaped formerly enslaved people in his church, and also sometimes in his house, because he was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And while that story is so important in its own right, I want to talk about a slightly different facet of his abolitionist work. His commitment to the hard, solid moral thinking and action by people of privilege. So Parker was using his white privilege to resist slavery and to resist the suffering. And he was educating other people, especially other Unitarian ministers, that your faith demands of you to act with compassion and a prophetic voice, and sometimes even disobedience. Your faith demands that of you. So in 1851, he is at the conference for Boston ministers, and one of the big issues here is enforcement of this 1851 fugitive slave law. So again, even free states like Massachusetts had to send escaped enslaved people back. So Unitarian, I think I mentioned we were not always on the right side of the issues. So Unitarian minister Ezra Gannett spoke to the meeting, and he told all the other ministers, we have to obey the fugitive slave law. This should be obeyed. And he had two reasons. Because if it be not obeyed, first, we shall violate all the human laws. And next, there will be dissolution of the Union. So to clarify, first, we're just going to willy-nilly break any law if we break the fugitive slave law. And second, the Union will pull it apart over the moral issue. Parker was really forceful in calling out Gannett's distorted thinking. In this public gathering, Parker gets up and he poses the question, who are the people that oppose the fugitive slave law? He says they are people who have always been on the side of law and order by not taking advantage and exploiting others. Their disobedience to the fugitive slave law is one of the strongest guarantees for the observance of any law that is just. Parker is saying that people who care about justice will not just go breaking any law, only those laws that destroy and oppress. He states that it's the people who obey the fugitive slave law who cannot be trusted because it's immoral, and it's so much more immoral than breaking the law. And what Parker is pointing out is justice. There will those who will stand with justice even when it's unpopular, even when it means disobeying, even when there are personal consequences. And remember, for Parker, his God is a God of mercy, of love, who takes in everyone. And he addresses Gannett's second assertion by saying, I'd rather lose everything to remain faithful to the God of justice. A God who sees enslaved people as humans, not property. And he says it is better for us, people of privilege, to suffer than to see one escaped enslaved person be sent back. He knows that that is a life of profound and endless suffering, not only for the enslaved person, but for any of their children. So let us be on the side of what is just and moral and right. So he's calling out these white ministers in their Boston pulpits for a failure to use that pulpit to inspire people to help alleviate suffering. And he confronts them all and he says, a little while ago we were told we can't preach on the matter of slavery because it's an abstraction. And then because the North was all right on the subject, or because it had nothing to do with us, you had to go to Charleston or New Orleans. But Parker calls foul. He reminds ministers and other listeners, we don't need to go down to Charleston. It is present in our own courthouse and our own city offices. We don't need to be the ones enslaving people to be the ones that are part of this moral problem. He says to the Boston ministers, I have escaped slaves in my church and my home. This is the crown of my apostleship and the seal of my ministry. He goes on to look at Gannett and say, Gannett preaches a sermon to justify the fugitive slave law, demanding that it should be obeyed. Calling on his church members to kidnap mine and sell them into bondage forever. All of this while Mr. Gannett calls himself a Christian and me an infidel. Parker says he will obey the laws of God, which say there is love for all. And there's another piece that we can take with us from Theodore Parker for today that is still true today. He's not addressing enslavers of the South. He's not addressing asylum-seeking African Americans living in his home and his church. He is addressing professional white men who have a pulpit that they could use for good instead of supporting evil. People have to use their privilege, is his message. That's where the work occurred then, and it's where our work still occurs now. Legislative reform had to come from white men because women could not vote, and people of color, for the most part, black people could not vote. Tragically, Parker died of tuberculosis before the Emancipation Proclamation. But he educated and inspired so many people to go on and do the work. And I like to think that he still lives on every time the Gettysburg Address is recited. So as we take in those stories, what is Unitarian Universalist history still saying? At the beginning of the service, I asked you to try to see this through the lens of 4 different things. And I knew it's impossible to remember 4 things, right? But I'll put them in the newsletter this week. And if you can just remember 1 this morning, that's good enough. How each of these people became proximate to those who were suffering. So they weren't just having an intellectual debate. They were really trying to understand what the lives of these people were like. Secondly, they went on to change a narrative. They offered a vision of what it could be like if there were services to the mentally ill, if prisons reformed, if enslaved people were free. Third, they fought against hopelessness at every turn and inspired others to do the same. And fourth, they took paths that were not comfortable or convenient, and they experienced public ridicule because of their beliefs. Interestingly enough, these are the exact four things that the current activist Brian Stevenson asks in his book, Just Mercy. That was our common Unitarian Universalist read, I think maybe 10 years ago. And I go back to those 4 points again and again, and I could hear them. I could hear Stevenson's 4 points as I read through the Unitarian history, because these people were using that, even though it hadn't been voiced that way at the time. And we get to use those 4 points into the future. Get proximate, change the narrative, fight hopelessness, and be willing to get uncomfortable. And come back here so you can receive sustenance and be renewed. So I'm going to leave you with this comment from Brian Stevenson. Hope is what gets you to stand when other people say, sit down. Hope is what gets you to speak when other people stay quiet. So I hope all of us this morning, through hearing our history, have engaged in some spiritual resurrection of purpose. And what will we ask ourselves to do in the weeks and months and years to come? Stay tuned, and blessed be.